Hello, I'm back with more bird synthesis, and today I'm going to try and synthesize a great tit. A great tit is a bird which effectively makes a two-note call, so it typically just alternates from one note to another. And here's the reference sample I'm going to use, which is a recording I took. Like last time, I'm going to import this sample into a spectral analyzer, so I'll be using RX. Let's load up the synthesizer we want to use, and we'll add a wavetable generator. As with the house sparrow, we'll start by copying the harmonic content of the bird. Where this bird differs to the house sparrow is that we can see it's got two different notes, and they each kind of have different timbres. We can see that this note here is quite pure, but this note here, if we zoom in, it's basically got a very fast, very slight vibrato to it. We'll need to click here to open the wavetable editor. We'll click this bottom pencil tool here. Go to RX and select a point which has a lot of energy. Then click Spectrum. We can see that the first harmonic has a level of around about -13. And here we'll draw -13. And the second around about -51. And the third around about -55. And then I'll normalize the frame peak. Then draw a curve down to -infinity. I'll set the harmonic scale to 0. Then we want to find out what the lowest frequency the bird ever calls is. In this case, it's actually this more complex note which goes lowest. So I'll select the lowest point of this, and it's around about 2600. Then we'll right click on Shift, type in 2600. We should now add a curve in the modulator area. And let's start by replicating this simpler note. So I'll select it here. We can see that the length is around about 190 milliseconds. We should then right-click the length of this curve, type in 190 ms. We can now use a selection tool to select the highest frequency of the simpler tone, and that reaches around about 5400 Hz. So we'll click this plus by the curve, right-click Shift, and then in this box here, we'll type in 5400. We can then draw in effectively this frequency curve in phase plant. What's worth noting, however, is that our lowest frequency is actually around about down here. This means that the line we draw in phase plant shouldn't go down to the lowest point of the curve. I'm now going to create a curve of the same length, so 190 milliseconds. Then I will assign this to the level of the oscillator at 100%. Let's give it a short fade in and a short fade out. This is effectively all we need for the simpler tone. So I'm going to bundle this all up in a group. And then I'll copy the group by clicking Control and drag. And back in RX, we can take a look at what we need to do for this sound. Its length seems to be around about 180 milliseconds. So I'll set this in these curves. For now, I'm going to disable the first group. We'll map the second curve in our new group to the level of the oscillator. We then want to learn how high this sound reaches. We'll select the top here, and that tells us that it reaches around about 7400. So we should click this curve, right-click the frequency, and type in 7400. Then we'll modify the frequency curve in phase plant to match the frequency curve in RX. At this point, we'll just try and replicate the general frequency curve rather than all the intricate detail of this sort of vibrato going on. Now we can try to replicate this fast pitch wobbling. To start, we can add an LFO and then map it to the shift. I'm not really needing to be too precise here because it's a fairly minor aspect of the sound. We're going to need it to be really fast. We should also set this LFO to the plus-minus mode. And this is really much too much vibrato, so let's tone it down a lot. I'd say that a sine LFO would be a bit closer to the way it looks in RX. Now we've pretty much replicated both of the main sounds we're trying to imitate, but what we need to do is to make the bird trigger both sounds alternately. What we should do first is make it so all of these curves aren't triggered by default from a note on. To do that, we right click this icon here, then go to note trigger and never trigger from note on. Do the same for this one. Likewise for all of our curves. Effectively, what we want to do now is to replace these with something else to trigger them. I'm going to do this using another curve. What we're going to do is assign high points of this curve to effectively trigger the other curves. To make this a bit more visually obvious, I like to modify the curve so it has a sharp spike at the start. First, I'll start by causing this to trigger the first sound. So we'll click the plus, and then we'll go over to the trigger section of the first curve, and also the same for the second curve. So these are both the ones for the first sound. So now when I press a key, it will trigger this right curve, and that curve in turn triggers these two curves on the left. But what we want to happen is for this to be triggered repeatedly. I've now changed this curve to have a sustain looping mode. Now what I can do is hold a note down on the keyboard, and every second it will trigger a note. If we go back to RX, we can figure out how often this should trigger a note. I'll select the start of one of these notes, and then I'll drag across to the next time that triggers. And that tells us it's around about 480 milliseconds. Now we need to set up a similar system for the other sound. So I'll start by copying this curve. I'll then go into the curve editor and I'll move this peak to be around about in the middle of this curve. And then we want this new curve to be triggering the second sound. So we'll do what we did before for the first sound, assigning it to these curves. One thing I notice now is that I think the vibrato is too strong. This makes me realize a mistake I did, which is having this LFO always be active. So what we can do to fix that is assign one of our curves for sound 2 to control how deeply the LFO is modulating the shift. So I'll go with this second one. So I'll click the plus, and then I'll click drag to modulate depth, and then I'll drag this down to 0. You can now hear that the LFO is only active on the second note. I think the first note is a bit too low pitched, so I'll change that. Now I'm listening back and forth between the synthesized version and the real sample, and I think this makes me realize that the first sound is drawn out a bit too long, so I want it to fade out a bit faster. I'll do something similar for the second sound. I'll now try it with a bit of reverb. And add in a bird sample in the convolver. I'm also going to add a bit of release to the envelope. Like with the sparrow, we'll add a random modulator and then set the frequency to 0. We'll set this to never trigger from note on, and then we can use one of our repeating curves to trigger this. We could map this to the shift, and we'll set a very low value. We can also just reduce the depth of the randomizer. And now we have a sound that resembles a Great Tit.